of the stuff that happens, what of that is important for the reader to know? For the past few weeks, we have each been working on some of the early scenes in our book, and one of the hurdles that we have run into is trying to figure out how to deal with the time gaps that occur right before our scenes start. So I'll let you explain your time gap first.
Well, and we're going to talk also about what we're going to do to overcome them. So we have found a potential solution. I have been working on the time gap between when our second main character, Vanessa, has her conversation with Arnold. Between there and the end of the day when she is processing that, there are things that happen in between there that shape how she approaches the second scene. So that's been the gap that I've been working through.
My gap is significantly shorter on the scale of it's probably just 2-3 minutes or so, but it is the gap between when Arnold has that same conversation with Vanessa and when he is processing that with his friend at lunch right after. So a very short period of time, but there's a lot that kind of goes through his mind of just while walking from one spot to the next that affects how that scene takes place.
Yeah, and what we've been facing is we want the reader to be able to understand what the character is thinking, how they're feeling, and how they got that way happened in the gap.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been trying to figure out how do we get the reader into that character's mindset.
So part of the struggle is looking at that gap, figuring out what happens there, and then figuring out of the stuff that happens, what of that is important for the reader to know and why is it important?
That was probably the first aha moment that we had in our conversation as we were trying to figure out how do I even convey what happens in this gap. First is going back to how does it make the story progress? What piece of that is important? And then as we were looking at it, we realized this isn't the first time we've had to solve this problem. We have a 16-year gap that happens from the time that the characters are born and other things that we do tell in other places. There's 16 years that turns these characters into who they are, that shapes how they approach the very first scenes that we see in them. So what we realized is it's the same problem, just at a much smaller scale. So a gap in between scenes is nothing more than a micro backstory.
So what we're going to do is end up treating the gap in the same way we treat a backstory, where we drip in little pieces of it as it's necessary to understand what's going on right now in the present.
So that pre-work that we just talked about, well, let's look at the gap, figure out of everything that happens here in this gap, what is important to the story. Then we can take the details that happen in that gap, tie them or create or invent details in the current story that give us a reason to have a micro flashback, a little memory, a verbal reference to whatever happened in the gap. So that's the approach that we plan to take.
And it helps us be more efficient because instead of taking the time to tell everything that happens in the gap, we're skipping past that and only referencing the major important parts that happened there. And we're all familiar with backstory being dripped in throughout a story. That happens a lot. And we think it's a little bit more difficult to think of gap micro backstories being dripped in, because often if it's done
examples of them,
right,
yeah.
To think of examples of it, because if it's done effectively, your mind kind of fills in the gap and you kind of don't even realize it was there. But as we were talking, the primary one that came to mind was looking at the very beginning of the movie Avengers Endgame, where the very start of the movie picks up pretty much right or very shortly after the previous one left off. And then after that scene is done, you have a 5-year gap. And then in the next few scenes, they show you a little bit of what has happened in those 5 years, not by actually showing you things that happened in those 5 years, but by showing you a rundown city, showing you people in therapy, showing you here is what has happened as a result of the previous 5 years.
And then your brain can go back and fill in that gap. Well, if this is what I'm experiencing now, this must be what has happened in that gap.
So that is how we're going to treat our gaps, like micro backstories, and dripping in just enough to let the readers know what has gone on in the character's mind in that time. So our question for you today is, what is a good example of a gap drip or a backstory drip that you can think of in storytelling? Let us know in the comments, and we will see you next week.